So welcome everyone. It's really my pleasure to moderate this conversation with the Fellows webinar. So the goal of this conversation is to discuss either research ideas, to have big debate on big ideas, and also for professional growth. So the idea today is really to discuss with our three guests how you can share your ideas in non-academic outlet, how you can better bridge the research practitioner gap. So I have really the pleasure to welcome three esteemed SMS Fellows and very accomplished scholars, Ron Adner from Dartmouth College, Julian Birkinshaw from London Business School, and Todd Zenger from the University of Utah. All of them, as you very well know, have made invaluable contribution to our academic field of strategy. I mean, for Ron, we associate his work with innovation ecosystem, with demand-based perspective on competitive advantage. Just to say a few words for Julian, we associate his name with innovation and bidexterity, transnational management, subsidiary innovation. And for Todd, we also associate his work with big idea around knowledge-based view of the firm, relational governance, firm boundaries. And what is very impressive about their contribution is that not only they have made invaluable contribution to our academic field, but they've also been able to reach out to a broader audience and to share their ideas in non-academic outlets. And so, again, what I would like today to emphasize is this idea that what is very interesting is, again, how you can, even as a very accomplished scholar, take the time to reach out and to publish through books, practitioner books, or through practitioner papers like in HBR or MIT Sloan. And so what the way we are going to organize the seminar today, I'm going to ask each guest to share 10 minutes their experiences about how they went about it, what trigger their willingness to some extent to publish in non-academic outlet. When did they do that in terms of at what stage of their career, what was the time investment, what were the potential trade-offs, and then more importantly, how they went about it. When did they start? What was the process they used? What were the challenges they met when they published their research in non-academic outlets? And then each of them will spend 10 minutes to share their story, their experiences, and then we will keep the final 20 minutes again for Q&As with the audience. So please feel free to share your comments and questions in the Q&A chat box. So Ron, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Laurence, and thanks everybody for being here. It's actually I didn't realize until just now with your introduction that we were thinking about non-academic outlets broadly as opposed to just books. And I think there's an interesting contrast between the two. So I can tell you, so my the main pillars of my intellectual journey, which end up being traced by my non-academic publications, are, I started my early work thinking about demand heterogeneity, and that the impact of thinking about how the existence of different customer segments and how we characterize them affects the way we think about innovation. That led me to the context of ecosystems, which came from the realization that these different segments, part of what makes them different is the components that need to be put together around the core innovation for different kinds of folks to be able to draw value from that innovation. And that led me to think about, well, if that's how we're innovating, what does that mean for the way we think about competition, substitution, and strategy? I was publishing actually from relatively early on articles in Sloan, in HBR, that really were encapsulations of these ideas that I was researching, but also introducing in the classroom. And what I would say about writing for managerial magazines is it's an exercise in, if you wanted to be polite, you would say in being concise. And if you wanted to be a little testy, you would say in dumbing down, which is you have this big idea and you need to press it into 2,500 words. So immediately you're going to lose a lot of things. And for me, kind of there's a really interesting contrast between that and writing a book. Because in a book, you can get much smarter through the journey than when you started, right? So like an HBO article is all about like, what are the main takeaways and don't burden me with other things. Whereas the luxury of a book is you have a huge amount of space to explore. And for me, writing first The Wide Lens, which was kind of pulling together ideas around how does the way we think about innovation change when we realize we need to pull together multiple components, changed the way I understood that material. And when that book came out 10 years later, during the 10 years between The Wide Lens and Winning the Right Game, basically I was confronting in my research, in my classroom, the question of, if that's how people are innovating, what does that change for the way we need to think about competition, industry boundaries, et cetera? And that's what gave rise to this second book. So that's like what motivated the journey. But just a side note already of, it's very different if you're thinking in book world versus article. I think kind of more mysterious, at least to me, had been the notion of a book and what, how you approach that. And I'd say the things I would highlight on that front are, so books are different than articles. Clearly, books that are trying to address non-academics are different than academic books. But I think it's interesting that a lot of our credibility as authors comes from the fact that we're academics, right? So I think it's really easy to write a book. You can produce it today with ChatGPT. It can be done in an afternoon, right? Just like, what you discover once you start publishing in research journals is that getting an article published means one thing, having it read is something totally different, and having it cited is a third totally different thing, right? And so I would say, given the investment of a book, my advice to folks is, especially since we tend to not get any meaningful reward from writing books in our profession, that you really, to make it worthwhile, you need to make sure that it's at least of great personal value to you, right? That journey will itself create some reward. But ideally, that it will also, create value for readers. And I think with books, it's kind of different than articles, where with articles, often you're thinking about writing, and there's an editor who's thinking about managing your writing, but really what the editor is thinking about is the readers. With a book, much more of that falls on you. And so I think you first write a book, and then at least my experience is, you first write the book, and then you rewrite the book with the perspective of what is it that you really want a reader to get. And I'd say, a book in 2024 is probably a much poorer investment of time than it was in 1980, given where attention spans are. And so I remember when I wrote Wide Lens, very top of my mind was, paying a lot of attention to the writing, realizing that at the end of any sentence, the reader has an opportunity to do anything else in the world, right? Like, so how do you compel them to stay? And that was before we had social media and TikTok and all these other distractions. So I think the hurdle for writing a book that will be read has gone up. And in that regard, non-academic audiences, I think, they're much less likely to get to the end of a section, let alone a chapter, than an academic audience is, right? By the way, the irony, of course, is academic audiences are much less likely to read books today than we are articles, right? Civilians, I think, are more likely, actually, on a relative basis, to read a book. The question is, how far in the book can you get them? And so that has to do, again, with, well, why are you writing it? and what's the idea flow that is going to drive it, right? And I think that a challenge that you see in a lot of books is that maybe they're longer than the content required, right? And that's where readership drops off. And then it's like, well, don't feel a hostage to the page, to some artificial page limit. I think today, shorter books are actually more in vogue. Not that I'm particularly good at writing those, but so I think that the second thing I'd highlight here is, besides like the intellectual journey, is understanding the different audiences. And then the third thing I would say, and then I'll hand it off to Julian, is that the one real advantage. So if you're a professor writing a book, it probably should be rooted in your research in some way, because that's a source of credibility. At the same time, being a professor itself kind of creates some suspicion, right? Like, what can this person teach me about the real world if I'm trying to manage it? That is, I think, particularly true in the context of strategy. It's more true in strategy than in OB, where, you know, you can have experiments that replicate things. Whereas if you're dealing at the level of companies, the way you develop your concept and the evidence required to be convincing, I think, is a little bit different. But the one thing that we have as faculty that many other people in this space, which, I mean, not to depress people, but, you know, there's like 15,000 business books published every year. That was a statistic from like 7 years ago. So it's probably a hell of a lot higher today. So I think, how many books are published every day? How many of like will actually be read? I think the average business book, I was told when Wide Lens came out, it sells like 500 copies, right? So if you lop off the, you know, the good to great type tail, that average probably goes way down. And so the question is like, so how do you get something to stick? And part of that, where we have a secret weapon, is being able to try to teach the things that we're writing in front of a sample audience of readers, right? And so I would really, if you're going down this pathway, I would really encourage anyone to fully leverage their classroom in the writing and editing and thought refinement process. I will warn you that when you put your own ideas in front of the students, it's very personal, right? So it's a little more hurtful when they don't get it or when they dismiss it. So you need like more humility to take in that feedback. But I think for me, kind of understanding where things are sticking and not sticking, and then refining that message helps tremendously when the words are put down in front of the final audience, where I don't have a chance to explain to a reader, here's what was confusing. So that's what I would say there. So there is an advantage that we have. And I think if you're going down this pathway, given what will ultimately be pretty substantial investment with, as I say, highly, highly uncertain and generally low returns, both, you might as well take advantage of the unique structural feature that we have, which is that we're professors and we have students.
Good. Thank you very much, Ron. Very insightful. Julian?
Yep, thanks. I will pick up the baton. And given that Ron talked about books, I'm going to talk about practitioner articles. I mean, I absolutely could talk about books, but Ron's done a terrific job, and I echo what he says. So I'll specifically talk about HBR, Harvard Business Review, Sloan Management Review, California Management Review. They're very, very different. I mean, Sloan and HBR are quite close. California is really different. But I'm going to speak about those three together because for me, they are places I seek to publish my research to reach a wider audience than a narrow academic audience. Laurence asked us about the when and the why and the how. I'll take them in that order. When did I start doing this? Actually, from the word go. I got my PhD out of Ivy Business School in Canada in '95. And I was already at that point thinking in terms of every academic article I write, I want to sort of see if there's a way of also translating that to the world of practice. So my first article, my doctoral thesis, which was in SMJ, came out as a Sloan Management Review article 2 years later. And I've done that all the way through. And I mean, I'll be quite honest, it sometimes has not helped me. I was up for tenure at London Business School. And in the year I came up for tenure, I published a book. It was called Leadership, the Sven-Göran Eriksson Way. And some of you have no idea who this guy was. He was the manager of the England soccer team for the World Cup in that year. He was a Swedish guy. It was a terrible book, I'll be quite honest. And I'd lived in Sweden, so I just fancied writing this book. Somehow I still got tenure. Anyway, the committee was kind enough to just ignore it. But the point I'm trying to make is that I've very often published because I just wanted to do something, not necessarily because I was, shall we say, managing my career. And really all the way through, since then, I've always, for every research project, I've said to myself, is there an academic angle to this? Is there a practitioner angle to this? And usually the answer is yes. Laurence asked, why, what motivates someone to do this? I mean, I guess my simple answer is I want to make an impact on the business world. And I know that there are different pathways through which you can do that. You can do it through your teaching, just simply by being a good teacher of your undergrad or your MBA students or your executives. You can do it obviously through your academic writing, which doesn't directly impact the practice of management, but if you come up with ideas which others then pick up on, you can indirectly impact the practice of management. And then through the HBRs and the Sloans and so forth, you actually do have a chance of meeting a pretty decent audience. I mean, Harvard Business Review is absolutely the one to aim for. Some of you know this, some of you perhaps don't. I mean, it's probably got 10 times the audience of Sloan Management Review in terms of the number of people that pick it up. I mean, more than 1 million people will pick up HBR. I'm not saying they'll read it, but they'll pick it up and actually kind of browse through what is the kind of the content. This is evolving because of the digital world in a way which we can get into later. So I've always done this. I think that's a good way of one of the mechanisms by which we influence the practice of management. Another point just to acknowledge, I mean, some of you either have recently gone through tenure or perhaps even coming up for tenure. I mean, look, it is very true that most business schools, most universities do not give any credit at all for practitioner writing for tenure decisions. And that's fine. I'm not in any way saying that's the wrong way to do it. But the reason I was always writing stuff, even pre-tenure, was that because I'd spent 3 or 4 years in Stockholm prior to moving to London Business School, I was always sort of ahead of the tenure curve in my own particular institution. So I felt I had a bit more latitude to do what I wanted to, rather than, shall we say, worrying about would I get tenure. So it's intrinsic to some degree. That's always the way I've wanted to do it. Let me spend 5 minutes on the how, and there's 2 different parts to the how. One is the way that you set up your research in the first place. Is there a chance that it might actually yield something that practitioners want to read? And I've always started with research questions or puzzles based on practice. In other words, here is a problem that I see managers talking about, rather than here is a gap in the academic literature. And if you start with a real life business problem, chances are there's a decent way of framing that both for an academic audience as well as for a practitioner audience. And an awful lot of my research, not all, but the vast majority, is either qualitative through interviews and surveys, or it's at least hybrid. It's at least partly qualitative. So there's always some kind of manager conversation somewhere in the background when I write my academic articles. And obviously those are gold dust when it comes to trying to translate your work for a practitioner audience. So that's how I set these things up. I always have in mind what is the business problem I'm trying to solve that I will then address to 2 different audiences. And then the other thing to say is about language and style and the way that you write the articles. I'm going to give you a couple of simple tips. Tip number 1 is purely around the style of writing. You know, as academics, we're trained to basically write very, very careful prose. Every sentence, every word has to be defendable, usually with a whole bunch of citations behind it. You know, the beauty of writing books or articles for practitioners is you are free. I mean, you are absolutely liberated to write in a style that suits you. And you have to work incredibly hard if you spent the last decade writing academically to unlearn that skill. I won't mention the person's name, but a very senior a colleague, a fellow of the SMS. He and I worked together on an article a few years back. And he's as well published as anybody. But that first article, it was his first ever attempt at writing for an academic, for a practitioner audience. And he struggled. I mean, for that first article, I had to kind of rewrite everything he wrote and say, no, that's just way too complicated. There's too much detail here or whatever. It's a steep learning curve, but he cracked it. And within, having done that one article with this person, he went on and wrote many other articles on his own. I'm not saying it's difficult. It's just you've got to unlearn a lifetime of very, very cautious writing. I will finish with just a top tip around if you want to write for, let's say, Harvard Business Review or Sloan Management Review. A good article for those two journals really only has 3.5 components. Component number one is, here is a thought that you've not had before. Here is a contrarian way of looking at the world. You thought the sky was blue, the sky is actually pink. You catch the reader's eye with some sort of deliberately contrarian point of view. Now, you can argue that we do that in our academic writing as well, and to some degree we do. But Harvard absolutely loves those contrarian starting points. Then they want a few examples. They don't want evidence. They don't want proof. They're not remotely interested in the hard evidence that proves your point. They want a few well-worked examples. There's sometimes a little box which justifies your research behind it. They want a few examples that make this come alive, maybe a few little simple statistics to prove the point. And then they want, so what? They really want to know, what are the 3 or 4 things a manager would do differently on the basis of that insight? It's incredibly simple. I mean, you read any HBR article, and those 3 components are really all that is in a typical one. Sloan Management Review, a little bit more involved. They want to see some evidence that there's some research behind it. California Management Review is a slightly separate story because there's usually some sort of literature review as well, which I won't get into now. But certainly, if you're interested in writing for one of these articles, the first thing to do is unlearn everything you learned as an academic writer, and then try to find a way of following that simple formula. I will stop there. I appreciate that I've probably gone on a little bit longer than I should. Back to you, Laurence.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. Very helpful. Todd, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, I appreciate being invited to this, and I've learned from both Ron and Julian here in this conversation. I would characterize it as, one of these things is sort of not like the others. And, I am a very late entrant into this exercise of writing books and sort of practitioner articles. I think it was probably 20 years before I got into the field and sort of got serious about thinking about a book. My father's in a profession where he tends to write business books, actually still does to some degree. And he would, for the first 20 years of my career, it was a yearly question, when are you going to write your first book? And so it was really, I suspect, partly in some deep psychological ways to address this guilt of never being able to respond to my father that I was, doing it, that sort of prompted it. I'm not sure that's totally true. But, for me, I think like all projects, whether academic or here practitioner, it really begins with an interesting problem. And I think what's a little bit, and this has been expressed already, what's ideally unique about a practitioner article or book is that, you're choosing and you're identifying a problem that's of some popular interest. I think, I think we all write with some sense and take up research projects that we do think have practical implication, but some of them obviously have more just appeal than others. And, we could probably collectively go through a list and sort of say, hey, that's something that a clever writer could get into Harvard Business Review, and that's something that would be very, very difficult. For me, the motivation was I took over teaching the corporate strategy class after about 5 or 6 years of being in the field. And it was taking up that, teaching that class and realizing that this that this was a complete, it was essentially a course that was a list of topics around a broad theme, that there was no sort of overarching integrative message. There was really just sort of scattered topics. And the other sort of, kind of spark, I think, that triggered the motivation there was, a recognition that if you're trying to teach people how to manage medium to large size enterprises, the whole apparatus of strategy was built around this idea of building competitive advantage. And yet, as you think about how we evaluate and reward CEOs and just enterprises generally and senior managers, it really had nothing to do, well, very little to do with competitive advantage. There were lots and lots of examples of corporations that had competitive advantages, but were absolute, disasters in terms of their performance, right? And that performance really is about relentless value creation. And we had really very poor tools to sort of think about that question of how do you provide advice about how to relentlessly create value. I think it was, that spark, plus I was at the same time doing academic work with Teppo Filin around this idea of strategy and entrepreneurship sort of being about the composition of theories that you could leverage, test, and evaluate. And it was really sort of that overarching idea of sort of, okay, so what firms that are very successful in relentlessly creating value possess is a theory that's guiding that exercise. And it was really that spark, as well as sort of just frustration with a course that always felt like it was, today is this topic, tomorrow is another topic, and nothing that sort of integrated these things. So for me, the motivation to step into this space has always been, frustration in teaching. As I think about a project I'm taking up currently in moving to Utah, I started thinking a whole lot about entrepreneurship and then began teaching entrepreneurship 5 years ago. And it's really frustration with what I see in the way, not just the way we teach it in the classroom, but also the way practitioners even think about that idea and concepts that's sort of pushing a current set of projects that are much more practitioner focused and facing. So for me, it's really about, passionate questions, frustrations with the way the world's currently thinking about it, frustrations with the way we're teaching it, and it has really been an exercise of developing those materials, those concepts, workshopping them in classes until that audience says, okay, this is right, this works. They don't quite say it that way, but you get good feedback, and that sort of says, okay, it's time to sort of pull this together into a book. At least, that's sort of been my experience. We were also asked to sort of comment a little bit about, when you do this. For me, this is a very difficult question. I tend to get involved with lots of co-authors, and they're often younger. And when I've got a younger co-author, I feel enormous amounts of guilt to focus on those projects, give them priority, work them through. And to be truthful, probably the reason I got my book done was because I decided to move from Washington University to Utah, and suddenly I had less committee work, fewer assignments, and I had sort of just a gap in time that I was able to sort of focus on that project. So I think, finding the space, and as I think about this current project and how many years it's sort of carried on, it's always, how do you make it not the last thing you take up? I think one of the most valuable things is some sort of commitment advice, or some sort of commitment device. And ideally that is that's a book contract, right? So you sign a book contract, you get some modest advance, and however modest it is, it provides a sense of guilt. Now you've got a deadline, and so you begin to prioritize this. So I think that's a very valuable mechanism. Some people sort of say, well, write the whole book and then submit it. That's great, but if you want a mechanism that motivates you, get a couple of chapters done, write an outline, find a book agent, get a contract in place, and now you've got, deadlines like you would have with a special issue, where you have no choice but to get this thing, done by a particular time, although there's a little bit more room for fudging in that space. But nonetheless, you can, if you're disciplined, you can make yourself believe that that's a hard deadline and push toward it. But I think sort of making space, making the time, it is not an easy project. At least I think is the way we academics take these things very, very seriously. It's all that unlearning that Julian spoke about. And if you want to write an effective, thoughtful book, it really does take a fair bit of time, and sort of finding those mechanisms that are going to discipline you, or finding the space to be able to complete that project, I think is really, for me, has been the biggest struggle. I will end there.
Thank you, Todd. Very interesting as well. So I would like to start with the first question we have in the chat, and I can only encourage the participant to put more questions. The first is really about sharing your experience on the submission and review process. So I guess here we should also make a distinction between the book writing process and the articles. So if one of you would like to pick up at least a book or practitioner articles, yeah.
Well, I'll take the articles one, because I started with that, and perhaps Ron, you want to take on the book. I mean, so for California Management Review and Sloan Management Review, they have now moved to a fully formalized traditional submission process that you would all recognize. In other words, you have to do it through the portal. You have to submit the manuscript. Sloan Management Review only sort of uses peer review. California Management absolutely uses peer review. But there is no kind of sort of going and talking to your favorite editor anymore in those two. Harvard Business Review continues to use sort of, you get to know one of the senior editors, and that person then kind of champions your case. I mean, there's a mechanism for submitting unsolicited manuscripts at Harvard Business Review, but if you want to publish there, I would always encourage you to talk to somebody who has published there, and to find a senior editor that you can proposition about that idea. And in terms of the review process, Harvard continues to essentially use a fairly opaque process of, if a senior editor likes it, they will kind of work with you to develop it, and then at some point they will pitch ultimately there's only 2 or 3 people at HBR who can really make editorial decisions, and they will then pitch your piece to that senior person, who will then say yes or no. The review process for Sloan Management Review there isn't really much of a review process in my experience. Occasionally you'll be asked to make small edits, but with Sloan it's more likely to be kind of, yes, we like it, please proceed, or we really don't like it. California Management Review is much more what most of you are familiar with. I have sometimes gone through 3 rounds of revisions with California Management Review, because they use academic reviewers, but academic reviewers are being asked to evaluate something not just on the basis of its academic merit, but on its impact for practice. You get reviewers all over the map, and it's difficult. That's all I'll say. I mean, if anyone wants to send me a note afterwards saying, I'm thinking of applying to a piece to California Management Review, give me some tips, I'm happy to do that, but it's probably too much information for right now. I'll stop there.
Yeah, just to build on the 3 journals, because we have a follow-up question on that from Mario Shivan, is do you always send to HBR or SMR first, given their prestige, and send only to CMR if it doesn't get accepted? Do you have a pecking order or
So,
very
so
different
for me, if it's a practitioner-oriented piece, it's HBR first, Sloan Management Review second. And basically the same piece can go to both. If you want to write for California Management Review, you've really got to write it differently. And the real downside of California Management Review is if it gets rejected from there, there's no obvious alternative place to send it. I mean, it used to be the case that the AMP, Academy of Management Perspectives, was a good second place to send such a piece to, but they've moved their focus more towards, they always want some sort of policy story in AMP, which is fine if you want to write about policy, but most of us, I suspect, don't. So that's the way I would answer that question.
Okay, thank you. I don't know, Ron or Todd, on the book submission and review process.
Do you want to take it?
Yes? Oh, Ron or yeah.
What's the question exactly? Like how
you kind of start in terms of submitting your book proposal and then the review process of a book. Writing.
Others may have different experiences. I found it very useful to, at least as a first-time author, book author, to have a book agent. It actually, I think the history is, I think I initially sort of did an informal submit to HBR, then got an agent and submitted it. And it was actually the agent that helped facilitate the contract with HBR Press. I think, you know, it's sort of, they work with you to refine the proposal. They work with you to, you know, then market that project. And so I just think, especially if it's a first time, it's very helpful to just sort of have somebody telling you how to do this process. You know, proposals aren't, you know, it's not rocket science, but I think there's some helpful tips that an agent can provide. They then submit it to publishers, and then, you know, once you have a contract, you're working with an editor directly. You know, Ron and Julian are going to have more experience with multiple publishers to share, but that's certainly been my experience.
Yeah. Ron, so you wrote two books kind of 10 years apart. Could you share your two experiences?
Yeah. So I think having an agent is good, not just for your first book. I mean, in some ways, like, you know, you're showing up to court without a lawyer. There's certain parts of the process. So if you think about a book, there's kind of the first phase is you're coming up with the idea for what your book is. And you're coming up with, I think, usually a proposal rather than a fully fleshed out manuscript to be submitted. Then there's a interest generating shopping around process, at the end of which hopefully you have a publisher that says, gee, Todd, I really like what you're doing. Here's a contract. We'll publish it. Then there's all this work that happens beyond and around writing the book. So just to be really clear, when you sign a contract with a book publisher and they give you $1, they have now bought your book, meaning it is their book. So your name is on it, but it's their book, and they get to make all kinds of decisions, like what is the title? Like what is the cover? Now, they don't want to exercise that authority, but those rights sit with them. And depending on what's happening, if there's friction, boy, it's so helpful to have an agent in your corner, because you're an author. How many books are you really going to write, right? You're dealing with these people once every, however many years, possibly once in a lifetime. Your agent generally is someone they're dealing with on a repeated basis, right? We have relational strategy experts on the call, right? We know they're going to be in a better position to manage and sort out any of those frictions. so that's helpful in the editorial phase. And then there's the phase where, okay, now you have a book and it's going out to the market. And here again, having somebody who's able to make marginal prompts and calls on the publisher is helpful. I think it's probably essential to know, if you're considering writing a book, that publishers generally are totally useless. Like their ability, and so you think it's their willingness, but really it's their ability to push your book out has just been lower and lower with every passing year, right? So what they're relying on more and more is, what they call the author's platform, like your ability to get your message out. But at the same time, they do have some resources, and I think having a third party at your side, this agent, helps you wring out a little bit more effort and more targeting than otherwise.
Mhm. Okay, thank
One
you.
quick note on, because I've also published a couple of books, and I mean, it's difficult to get an agent. Don't think the audience don't think this is trivial. A couple of times I've talked to agents and they said, thanks, but no thanks, because they're busy people, and they want to take the ideas where they think they've got a chance of getting the book with a sort of a mass market publisher, and there's very few publishers who really can take a business book and take it to a mass market. So I mean, it's great to get an agent, don't get me wrong, but they're hard to find. And my last couple of experiences, what I've ended up doing is it's a bit scattergun, but I've kind of gone to half a dozen or so book publishers who I know might be interested in publishing my book. I mean, Harvard and Stanford University presses in the US. There's a couple in the UK as well. But there's fewer than there used to be. And I've discovered, even though I've published several books, I've published that they are often saying no nowadays. It's actually getting, I think Ron touched on this, it's actually getting harder to get a decent publisher than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, and by the way, I think that is, again, not to press people on the call, but this is an SMS call, so we're generally targeting strategy. What I was originally surprised by, and I think it's only become more so, is the strategy market for business books is relatively small, right? So if you're a publisher, you're in the business of trying to sell lots of books. And in some ways, the more elite your audience, right? Oh, this is a book for CEOs. We say that with pride. A publisher hears it like, oh, so this is a book for, there's a 50,000 person company and you can sell it to 8 people, right? And so there's this trade-off between, how high up the hierarchy you want to speak to and how big that audience is. And the reason that there's an interesting choice there is because if you can, however, influence people at that level, boy, you can have huge impact. And so, so when you're talking to a publisher about a strategy book, there's always this tension of, so assume it's a good book. How do I think about the audience for it? Like, how far down in the organization can you justify its message being shared? And again, I think the other, from a marketing perspective, the other twist that we have is, maybe there's a possibility of, the book or a part of the book getting into curricula, right? And that, from a publisher's perspective, remember, in the end, they're trying to run a business and keep it afloat. Kind of pointing, I think it's actually harder to pull off than it is to suggest. But so it's on them to decide if they want to buy the argument or not. But that's another thing that we as faculty have that other authors don't, which is like an idea of, oh, could this speak into a classroom, and ideally not just your classroom. But that, again, that raises the bar on what it is you need to produce to get someone like Julian to create space in an already packed class to let's hear from from this other person.
Yeah, thank you. Just to follow up on the question here from the chat, a question from Adetunji. It's about whether how important professional editorial writing support is for these outlets. In your opinion, can a decent academic writer learn to write well enough for these outlets, or you would always advise to engaging professional writing support? What is your experience?
Well, I mean, frequently, I think, again, I can only speak from one experience, but it was, you're working with a publisher, an editor with the publisher who's quite skilled. They're going to take a heavy hand in editing the manuscript. They have an interest as well in sort of making it successful. So, I'm not sure, I'm not sure you necessarily have to employ an outside editor. The book publisher is going to want to take a heavy hand in sort of editing it themselves. So I think, that's part of what your contract with them is, that's their job, is to make this thing, they've seen your writing from the proposal. They like it enough, and now they're working with you to sort of get it into a place where they think it's going to sell to their audience. So I don't know that you're going to need to employ somebody on, additional beyond that.
But certainly, if you're writing a practitioner-oriented article and you've never done that before, at a minimum, you need to get a colleague like one of us who's written for those sort of audiences. And I would actually argue that it's probably worth getting paying somebody to do some redrafting, to tighten up and to sort of streamline and sometimes, frankly, to simplify your arguments, because most of us are not attuned to writing in a way that is going to be accessible. For sure.
Yeah, although I guess so. Yes.
Yeah.
However, the particularly if you're talking to book editors outside of like the hard business press, I think those people are, long lived and experienced. And many other publishers, the book editors are kind of youngish, middle-aged, keep in mind English majors, right? So their expertise is very different than ours. And I think it's, you want to make sure that your book is still your book. And where I've had, so I have to say, like the last experience I had with Winning the Right Game was a spectacular editorial experience, because the editor was really, one, she was more experienced, so understood more of the landscape, but it was really there was kind of questions about, can you simplify this? At the same time, respect for things that are complex and need to be addressed as complex. Right. Again, part of this goes back to like, well, why are you writing this book? Right. And I think for most of us, it's not because you're expecting, oh, this is going to buy, my third house. Right. It's because I want to share these ideas with the world. And I think the thing to guard against is having those ideas morph in ways that you don't like through an editorial process, which when it works is amazing. If it's too heavy-handed, is less amazing. And so it's worth remembering that. And remember, you're the expert in your book, not the editor.
I just want to just jump in, piggyback on what Ron just said, because my first practitioner book, I was a bit daunted by the idea of writing 60,000 words or whatever. So I actually got the publisher to recommend a ghostwriter to help me. And it was a disaster. I mean, she knew how to write, no question. But, by the time she'd taken my ideas and turned them into prose, I just couldn't live with it. So I ended up, essentially sacking her and doing it myself. And it took a lot longer. I'm not saying it was better. I'm just saying that I'm building on Ron's point that you've got a thought about what you're trying to get across, and finding somebody who can, articulate that voice in an effective way is quite difficult.
Now you can just train ChatGPT to have your voice and.
Well, it is absolutely true that ChatGPT is being used in these situations. And that's a whole other conversation.
Actually, interesting. I had a conversation with an editor a couple of months ago, in their contract explicitly, you have to state that you did not use ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Because work generated by ChatGPT is not covered by copyright.
Yes.
And so that'll be an interesting dynamic to see how it unfolds.
I have another practical question here. As researchers, we are trained to write articles by citing and acknowledging other scholars. A publication like HBR contains no citations. How do you make the leap to writing without citations?
I mean, I've already offered a few thoughts on that. So perhaps one of you guys wants to pick up that question.
I mean,
So-
you can get away with referencing by name an idea associated with a scholar. I certainly have done that in the HBR pieces. But, you know, otherwise, you know, think of you have to adopt a different voice here, right? You're just communicating ideas to people. And, you know, you adopt a voice where, you know, it's not necessarily coming from you, you're just communicating the ideas, but you know, it does get some, you know, it does take some getting used to.
Yeah, and you know, with HBR, they do have a further reading list where you can suggest other people's work to look at. And then of course in a book, you know, you can do all the citing that you want. Usually you wouldn't do it in text, right? You do it in endnotes or footnotes. But I think, remember HBR, if you're offering a lit review, it's probably not what they're looking for, right? So if you can't come up with an argument that stands on its own as original or based in your work, I think the likelihood that they'll engage with it is lower. So I think that's like guidance for like refining what it is that you're trying to say in a way that is sufficiently original.
Okay. Laurence, one little additional point, I should have made it earlier. All three of the practitioner-oriented journals I mentioned now have online short article options. And so what I was talking about was the kind of the proper published article in the, as it were, in the physical magazine. But they've all got these alternative shorter pieces, typically 1,000, 1,500 words. The hurdle to get those published is much lower. And for anyone who's trying out for the first time to get into any of those journals, it's probably a good place to start, because they will give you feedback on your ideas. They're more likely to say yes. You've just got to have a little bit less stuff to give them, and that's and then you can put, as it were, Harvard Business Review on your CV if you want to do that. You know, it's not got the same readership, but it's still a worthwhile way of getting used to that audience.
Yeah, let me build on your the topic, Julian. Can you, think of alternative, because we are talking about non-academic outlets, and given the social media and so on, and what you were mentioning about that it's increasingly more difficult to publish a book. We are not even sure that we can grab the interest of the reader given the kind of shorter span of attention and so on, of our students and executive and so on. Would you recommend, for example, podcasts, YouTube channels, and other ways where you have seen colleagues embarking on different ways of reaching out to practitioners? Or is a book a kind of...
I'll speak for myself, but please, Ron. So, I mean, I have often blogged on LinkedIn, for example. And I have a decent following on LinkedIn. And if I write an 800-word piece, it's sort of top of mind. I'm not sure I can be bothered to try to frame it in a way that would get it onto harvardbusinessreview.org. I put it out on LinkedIn, and 3,000 people like it or whatever. So it's actually quite an efficient way of reaching a decent audience. And of course, you continue to own that, right? Whereas as soon as you submit something, just like one was saying with your book, as soon as you submit to one of these journals, they own your material, which is not something that most of us particularly want. Forbes has a mechanism that is available to many people whereby you maintain your copyright, but you publish on their platform. So there are definite alternatives. Ron?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And again, there's this trade-off, right? So LinkedIn, you can post
Right.
and it goes out.
Yeah.
Maybe some people click, maybe some people don't. That is true of everywhere else. You know, it's not citable, right? It would be unlikely to be cited, but that's different from saying it has no impact. So again, this goes back to so why is it that you're trying to communicate with this audience? I think, some people are having incredible success with Substack type, blogs, where I think this point about when you're giving up your content when you're going with these traditional publishers.
Yeah.
You could reuse it relatively easily, but there's still, you're transferring a copyright. So I think I wish I had a better answer to how to really use social media. I am kind of a dinosaur in that regard, but I suspect that the likelihood of an HBR article taking off and a LinkedIn article taking off, HBR is probably a little bit higher, but the readership out of a LinkedIn article that their algorithm is going to promote is probably orders of magnitude greater.
Interesting.
Right? The chances of, so again, I would say probably a portfolio approach makes sense today. I wouldn't give up on one and focus on just the other, but I would definitely not focus on just.
Yeah. Okay.
One other outlet I'd quickly plug is there's a consortium of business schools that's sort of promoted this management and business review.
Yeah.
And I had a good experience publishing a piece there, and we were able to get it open access, and then you can distribute it easily. But that's a more traditional review process with an editor, but it was a again N of 1, but it was a good experience there.
Okay. So now I guess it's time for closing this session. We had, because we are, reaching the hour, we had a very interactive session. We didn't have time to answer all the questions, but please feel free to reach out to us through email if you want, if you have specific follow-up questions and comments. So Ron, Julian, Todd, thank you very much for sharing your experiences. That was really very helpful and insightful. So thank you very much and have a very nice day.
Thanks very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody.